Us now, Wyoming Congresswoman Liz Cheney, still the #3 Republican in the House. Congresswoman, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Great to be back with you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
So, as Mike Emanuel just reported yesterday, your home state, Wyoming Republican Party, censured you and called for you to resign immediately, saying that you had betrayed the trust of Wyoming voters. Are you going to step down?
I'm not, Mike and Chris, sorry. And look, I think people all across Wyoming understand and recognize that our most important duty is to the Constitution. And as I've explained and will continue to explain to supporters all across the state and voters all across the state, the oath that I took to the Constitution compelled me to vote for impeachment, and it doesn't bend to partisanship. It doesn't bend to political pressure. It's the most important oath that we take, and so I will stand by that, and I will continue to fight for all of the issues that matter so much to us all across Wyoming.
They debated, your home state Republican Party, they debated for 11 minutes before deciding to censure you, the Congresswoman, the #3 Republican in the House. What's that about?
Well, I think you have to read the language of the censure partly. I think, you know, that people in the party are mistaken. They believe that BLM and Antifa were behind what happened here at the Capitol. That's just simply not the case. It's not true. And we're going to have a lot of work we have to do. People have been lied to. The extent to which President Trump, for months leading up to January 6th, spread the notion that the election had been stolen or that the election was rigged was a lie. And people need to understand that. We need to make sure that we as Republicans are the party of truth and that we're being honest about what really did happen in 2020. So we actually have a chance to win in 2022 and win the White House back in 2024.
You know, there really, Congresswoman, are two questions here, one of which is the role of President Trump. That's going to be debated in the Senate this next week, but also the future of the Republican Party. In Washington this week, you survived a challenge to your position as the House Republican Conference chair, but there was fierce blowback to your decision to vote to impeach the president. Take a look at some of that.
She didn't just go voter conscious on the day of the vote. She spoke ahead of time, 36 hours, put out a statement.
Why is it that America has such a disappointing Congress? Because in a lot of ways, Liz Cheney is exactly like Congress. Deeply unpopular and owned by special interests.
Does it bother you that there was more open outrage among House Republicans to your vote to impeach the president, a vote of conscience, as you say, than to the years of misstatements by Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene?
Look, I think that, first of all, with respect to Congresswoman Greene, we've all been very clear. The things that she has said don't have any place in our public discourse, and we as a Republican conference should deal with that issue. We should have dealt with it. That's not something that the Democrats should be addressing on the floor of the House. We should have dealt with that. With respect to where we are as a party, I think that the vote in conference made very clear we are the party of Lincoln. We are not the party of QAnon or anti-Semitism or Holocaust deniers or white supremacy or conspiracy theories. That's not who we are. We believe in conservative principles and conservative values, and we believe in the Constitution. And the extent to which, if you think about the threats that the nation faces and you think about what happened on January 6th, I talked to Officer Sicknick's mother this week, and I pledged to her, as I know many of my colleagues have, that we will not forget what happened on January 6th. And that the single greatest threat to our republic is a president who would put his own self-interest above the Constitution, above the national interest. You know, we've had a situation where President Trump claimed for months that the election was stolen and then apparently set about to do everything he could to steal it himself. And that ended up in an attack on the Capitol, 5 people killed that day. That's the kind of attack that can never happen again. Our institutions held, but we all have an obligation to make sure that they continue to do so, and don't look past what happened on January 6th. It was, you know, just over a month ago.
I just want to ask you one more question about January 6th. When you voted to impeach the president, you said this. He, quote, summoned this mob assembled the mob and lit the flame of this attack. Everything that followed was his doing. There has never been a greater betrayal by a president of the United States of his office and his oath to the Constitution. Congresswoman, one of the things you certainly are is a straight talker. Would you vote to convict President Trump of incitement of insurrection?
If I were in the Senate, I would obviously listen to the evidence. I think that that's the role the Senate has as jurors. I would also point out, though, Chris, that the Senate trial is a snapshot. There is a massive criminal investigation underway. There will be a massive criminal investigation of everything that happened on January 6th and in the days before. People will want to know exactly what the president was doing. They will want to know, for example, whether the tweet that he sent out calling Vice President Pence a coward while the attack was underway, whether that tweet, for example, was a premeditated effort to provoke violence. There are a lot of questions that have to be answered, and there will be many, many criminal investigations looking at every aspect of this, at everyone who was involved, as there should be. But I stand firmly by my statement. We've never seen that kind of an assault by a president of the United States on another branch of government, and that can never happen again.
So just to press that, if you were in the Senate, would you vote to convict?
If I were in the Senate, I would listen to the testimony. I would listen to the evidence. If you're a senator, you have a responsibility to be a juror, and I think that's very important. But I obviously believe and did then that what we already know is enough for his impeachment. What we already know does constitute the gravest violation of his oath of office by any president in the history of the country. And this is not something that we can simply look past or pretend didn't happen or try to move on. We've got to make sure this never happens again.
I want to pick up on because you criticized, at the very beginning, you criticized Democrats for voting to strip Marjorie Taylor Greene of all of her committees. After the House voted this week to remove her from those committees, you issued a statement and you said this: Speaker Pelosi and the Democrat majority have no business determining which Republicans sit on committees. But Congresswoman, your GOP caucus debated this issue and ended up giving Congresswoman Greene a standing ovation. So can you really blame Democrats for moving to act when the House Republican caucus didn't?
We should have, Chris. This is exactly the kind of issue that we should address inside of our conference. If you get into a situation where whoever has the majority in the House decides who sits on committees from both parties, you might as well not have anybody in the minority on any committees. So it should not have gotten to the point that it did. I don't believe that the Democrats have any business determining who from the Republicans sits on committees, but we should have dealt with it ourselves. And I think it's very important that we're absolutely clear that those views and those beliefs do not have any place in our public discourse. We'll want to see action now from Congresswoman Greene, that backs up the kinds of words that we've seen over the last few days and the kinds of apologies. But we have to be very clear that's not who we are as a party.
I mean, that, of course, is the question, is whether it is who you are as a party or not, because all of this gets to where the GOP is. Here was Congresswoman Greene's defense on the House floor this week. Take a look.
I never said any of these things since I have been elected for Congress. These were words of the past, and these things do not represent me. You see, school shootings are absolutely real. I also want to tell you 9/11 absolutely happened.
You say that her opinions have, your words, no place in the party, but she said this week that she raised $330,000 in 48 hours and that President Trump supports her. And I want to remind you that just the week before last, your House Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy, met with Mr. Trump at Mar-a-Lago and said the former president will campaign for Republicans in the 2022 elections. So the question is this still the party of Donald Trump, and does Marjorie Taylor Greene still hold a solid place in that party?
Chris, we're the party of Abraham Lincoln. We're the party of Ronald Reagan. We have to really take a hard look at who we are and what we stand for, what we believe in. I think when you look at both his actions leading up to what happened on January 6th, the fact that he was impeached in a bipartisan fashion, the fact that he lost the presidency, the fact that we lost the Senate. We have to be in a position where we can say we stand for principles, we stand for ideals. Somebody who has provoked an attack on the United States Capitol to prevent the counting of electoral votes, which resulted in 5 people dying, who refused to stand up immediately when he was asked and stop the violence. That is a person who does not have a role as a leader of our party going forward. We have to make sure that we are able to convey to the American voters we are the party of responsibility, we are the party of truth, that we actually can be trusted to handle the challenges this nation faces, like COVID. And that's going to require us to focus on substance and policy and issues going forward, but we should not be embracing the former president.
All right, let's focus on the other side for a moment. Joe Biden has been president for 2.5 weeks. How's he doing?
You know, it's really, it's heartbreaking in many ways, Chris, because, you know, we watched the inaugural speech where he spoke of unity, where he spoke of trying to work together, and the immediate actions we've seen with respect to, you know, things like canceling the Keystone Pipeline. It's heartless, it really is. The people that are being put out of work, when you look at the ban on additional permits for oil and gas leasing on public lands, you know, my state of Wyoming, not only is that absolutely devastating to our energy industry, but the resources that come from those leases are what we use to fund our schools. It's what we use to fund services in our local communities. So we've seen a number of immediate executive orders that really are very damaging, very negative. And the COVID package that's been proposed, the $1.9 trillion, even Larry Summers has said that, you know, this could cause real fiscal challenges for us. It could bring increased inflationary pressures. So I think that we really do have to fight back against, stand up against the kind of far left governing that we've seen so far out of the Biden administration.
Congresswoman Cheney, thank you. Thanks for your time. Always good to talk with you.
You too, Chris.